Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin here after a week absence. I appreciate Konstantin for filling in for me with a great episode with Dmitry last week. I am, of course, traveling across Russia. I've been to Moldova. A lot of big things coming in the future. I'm not headed back to the US just yet, so big things are coming. Stay tuned. Be sure to follow us on the social media and subscribe here on Substack, worldwarnow.co. In my absence, of course, as usual, we see a bit of dip in subscribers, so please get behind the paywall if you support the work that I'm doing, if you support the coverage of the persecution in Moldova and, in general, just these on-the-ground reports and travels that I'm doing. We can't do all of this without your support. So check out the links below, go to the Substack and support us. But obviously, this has been a huge week. We're obviously going to be focusing on the UN General Assembly in New York, discussing the new countries that have recognized Palestine, as well as the actual on-the-ground developments within Palestine itself. Huge announcements, unfortunate announcements from Trump about the future of the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to be breaking all of that down, as well as some new conflicts in Thailand, Cambodia, and even Ladakh and Kashmir. I guess old conflicts now re-emerging despite Trump saying that he has, solved and caused peace in dozens of wars. Those wars seem to be ready to ramp back up at any given moment. Of course, there's some church persecution news we're going to be bringing to you, and obviously major frontline updates from Russia, Ukraine itself. I am in Moscow. There have been reports of drone strikes. I believe it was Monday night. I didn't hear anything, but apparently a massive drone attack was launched on Moscow from the Ukrainians. But it appears the Russian air defense did its job, and I was completely unharmed. So again, strap in. This is going to be a great episode. I don't know how long it's going to be. I've been a little bit out of it, not quite as well read on the news, but the past few hours I've been reading everything I can and getting updated. And obviously, we're going to start with the latest things going on in the UN. New speeches are still being given as we're recording this, so be sure to stay tuned to the World War Now Telegram at World War Now Telly, or follow us on X at World War Now _ to keep up to date with the latest updates there. But with all of that, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad, and you're completely right. It's good to have you back to discuss this very important 80th anniversary United Nations General Assembly 2025. If you recall previously, we did discuss on our September-October episodes the United Nations annual meetings. However, they weren't as eventful this year because the Gaza genocide has escalated. The Ukraine-Russia war has reached literally staggering new limits in terms of the conflict's duration, the amount of cities being besieged, the bombs being dropped. There's clearly an ongoing escalation in this Third World War circumstance and scenario we're kind of discussing here. And a lot of the world leaders are actually in New York this week to discuss a lot of the events which we're going to be talking about today. So it's really important that we break down some of the perspectives we've been hearing. Now, I guess let's start with the bad news first. We have seen the president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, actually meet up with Zelensky on the sidelines. I believe it was in one of the cabinet rooms of the United Nations building in New York, and they actually spoke English in front of the camera. There were several reporters asking them questions about Ukraine and Kazakhstan as these former Soviet CIS countries, SMG countries, which are now going to collaborate and cooperate. But notice Tokayev, of course, with Xi Jinping, he speaks fluent Chinese. With Putin, he speaks Russian. And with Zelensky, he switches to English because, of course, Tokayev is very erudite. He's a polyglot of some sort, but he doesn't speak Ukrainian. But he will not speak Russian with Zelensky. It's a sign of disrespect, but also a signaling of some sort, because we know that Tokayev, Kazakhstan, has been cooperating with the West in very bizarre and strange ways, which we've covered on the show on a weekly basis. So that's one of the strange, bizarre news. We've also seen, of course, al-Sharaa al-Jilani, the president, essentially of Syria at the moment, what we call occupied Syria, former Al-Qaeda, former HTS, al-Nusra, essentially a very strange former terroristic figure, now a leading politician, giving interviews, meeting up with literally the who's who in the zoo at New York, meeting up with Marco Rubio, for example, right? This is somebody who claims to be a Roman Catholic, and this is a member of a former terrorist organization. Now I think HTS has been delisted in America from being on terror list, and it's just very interesting how al-Sharaa al-Jilani has been integrating himself into the international community, not just meeting with people like Marco Rubio, but obviously Donald Trump earlier this year, Giorgia Meloni as well, which is curious because she has her positioning as the leader of the Italian right wing, Conrad, was very anti-migrant, essentially quasi-anti-Islam, because most of the migrants, of course, coming from North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, crossing the Mediterranean, coming into Italy, those illegals as well as so-called asylum seekers and refugees, they happen to be, of course, followers of Islam. So it's very obvious here that she's betrayed all of her values. And we knew this years ago when she, of course, supported Zelensky and the Ukrainian regime. And she came out, obviously, she was trying to run in the first place as this sort of anti-European war candidate and somebody who's nationalistic, like a Trumpian, but that's all false, of course. She's a globalist in the realist sense. And meeting al-Sharaa, al-Jilani just is evidence for that. But I think the biggest slap in the face, and this is even more egregious, especially to Americans who've been fed this war and terror propaganda for many years now. And I say propaganda because in the realist sense, terrorism was of course real. Islamic terrorism really did exist, but America did not, the American deep state did not attempt to properly resolve the issue abroad. In fact, in some cases, it worsened it. In 2010, 11, 12, Operation Timber Sycamore took place. Our astute readers and listeners can probably go and search that up. It's now disclosed, probably one of the many operations that the CIA conducted granting weaponry and equipment. This is American taxpayer dollar, top-of-the-line military equipment to rebel groups in, I believe it was Syria at the time, from the Iraq border, so across the David's corridor, right from Iraq to Syria in order to fight against Bashar al-Assad in 2011 and 12 specifically. And the man in charge of that CIA operation, or at least the director of the CIA at the time in the Obama administration, was none other than General Petraeus, who we know now is a big sort of neocon type figure. He was never like a positive character to begin with, right? Clearly very like a career Democrat, anti-Trumper, etc. But even worse, he sat down with al-Sharaa al-Jilani, a former member of al-Qaeda. And they were even joking at the fact that how al-Sharaa al-Jilani has turned his life around, and how General Petraeus actually, his men arrested al-Sharaa al-Jilani and put him into prison back in the day in Iraq. And they were joking about how, a member of former al-Qaeda could now be collaborating with the former director of the CIA. And it's the biggest gaslighting I think I've ever seen, Conrad. And if only these villainous characters weren't, if only their decision-making wasn't so impactful. But unfortunately, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, a lot of these talking heads, these figureheads, and we don't really know who the real decision-makers are behind the scenes, they're the ones who are really being put forward as the rational political leaders of big groups, millions of people. So it's really disrespectful to the electorates of their respective nations. And the other very important thing, and a lot of people may have mentioned this on Telegram X, the microphones of many of the speakers who were pro-Palestine, in fact, were surprisingly getting cut off during their respective speeches to the UN General Assembly, in particular the president of Indonesia and the president of Turkey, Erdogan. And we know Erdogan and his two-faced approach towards Palestine and against Israel, right? Clearly, Turkey is the second largest member state of NATO. Turkey supports the US. The US directly funds and promotes the Palestinian genocide, and unfortunately, Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip. And yet Turkey counter-signals professionally against what the Israelis' actions in Palestine. Turkey also supports al-Sharaa al-Jilani, who now also vows, as the new president of Syria, to support Israel to find lasting peace of the Israelis. Essentially, what Israel is preparing, Conrad, is a new Camp David Accords. As we remember, I think it was 1978, when the president of Egypt, al-Sadat, and the Prime Minister of Israel, essentially at Camp David in America, signed a long-lasting peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which I think stands to this day, which is why Egypt never goes to war against Israel. So I think al-Sharaa al-Jilani, they're going to plan a new Camp David for the Syria-Israeli angle. And of course, Syria will be brought to heel, which it has already. And it's very interesting how some of these speeches, most of them, especially from the Muslim leaders around the world, the prime ministers, the presidents, the UN representatives, right? They were pro-Palestinian, but they were all rhetorically very powerful, strong. And it seems like the majority of the world, even in the West, and this is probably the most striking thing, because we have huge Western countries. These are majority, say, white countries, nations which are NATO members, nations which are, part of the EU, we would say part of the liberal, globalist, unipolar world agenda, recognizing Palestine, Conrad. It's probably the strangest news of the week. Leading nations such as the UK, France, Australia, Canada, for example, former members of the British Empire, all recognizing Palestine. And again, Palestine is not really defined in any sort of territorial borders, but as a nation state within this allegedly unipolar sort of unitary state that is Israel, Palestine is given an identity. And they're saying, look, there is a Palestine that exists within this apparently sovereign Israeli state. It just needs to be properly defined and we recognize it. So generally it's a good move, but I wonder what motives could be behind it. Like we know Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, clearly a big Freemason, a pusher of degeneracy, probably a groomed man himself. I'm not going to push the whole Candace Owens version of events, but a very strange personality. Keir Starmer as well, he has a Jewish wife. The King Charles, well, we don't really need to go into details about him. He's claiming to be like a member follower of Islam in like a Sufi way. He's a big ecumenist, for example, travels to an Orthodox monastery one weekend and the next weekend he goes to a mosque. Strange characters. These are not really people who are trustworthy. They're always very shifty in their actions. So it's kind of good to look behind the scenes or at least speculate and infer what we can gather about their motivations in recognizing Palestine. I think, Conrad, one of those motivations is probably to appease the masses of Islamic migrants that they themselves brought over into their respective nations over the last 25 to 50 years of hyper-liberal policies. This is their legitimization of the views of these particular new citizens, these new Europeans, these new Canadians, and they're just trying to appease the new electorate that they've, of course, now included in their respective white, or shall we say now, mixed countries.
No, that's very true. And I have the full list of every country that has, at least at this latest round of the UN General Assembly, recognized Palestine. Of course, France being the leader of this endeavor is at the top of the list, but it's curious. It was about 10 countries have now recognized Palestine. A few others recognized Palestine in the past few years. On the full list of those that have recognized it at this latest General Assembly, of course, you have Portugal, Canada, Australia, the UK, Andorra, Belgium, Monaco, Malta, Luxembourg, and France. So a lot of those countries are not super relevant, but Portugal, the UK, France, Canada, Australia, these are very, very relevant countries when it comes to the United Nations. And you look at the history of Palestinian recognition, of course, Mexico recognized Palestine just earlier this year. And then the only other countries to recognize it in 2024, you had Armenia, Slovenia, Ireland, Norway, Spain, and then a bunch of Caribbean countries. And then if you go before that, the latest country to recognize it was all the way back in 2019. So we have now gotten to the point where 157 of the 193 UN member states have recognized Palestine. Obviously, the major one that hasn't is the United States. And then there are a bunch of those other little islands, much like these little countries that did recognize Palestine. The Israeli side has a few of those like Palau, Nauru, the Marshall Islands. These countries really only exist to be votes for Israel and the United States within the General Assembly to make it look like it isn't the entire world versus Zog, the US and Israel, which many, many times it is. So it's just a bit of muddying the waters there on their part. But in the midst of all of this, obviously Trump and everybody have been openly saying that this Palestinian recognition is a reward to Hamas. And basically the Israelis, with U.S. approval, are moving to, on the ground, stop Palestine from existing so that this recognition, even if it exists officially, doesn't mean anything on the ground because these people have been killed, displaced, or whatever it is that the Israelis are trying to do. But as all of this was happening, of course, Operation Gideon Chariot 2, all of the Gaza City genocide is still ongoing. This is from Dave DeCamp. He says Israeli forces killed dozens more Palestinians in Gaza on Tuesday as the IDF continues its U.S.-backed destruction campaign in Gaza City with the goal of cleansing the city of its Palestinian population and razing every building to the ground. Among the buildings destroyed on Tuesday was the main health center for the Palestinian Medical Relief Society, a 6-story building that was leveled by Israeli strikes. According to the AP, the charity said the building was destroyed after an Israeli evacuation order and that the center served as one of the main facilities in the city that provided blood donation and testing services, trauma care, cancer medicine, and others. Sources told Al Jazeera that at least 2 medical workers were wounded in the strike that leveled the health center. Al Jazeera also reported that 34 Palestinians in total were killed so far on Tuesday, the majority within Gaza City. So we're well over 100, potentially 200,000 people dead. I mean, I think it's much more than that at this point in Gaza, around the Palestinian region. There's also major deaths in the West Bank as Smotrich's E1 plan and the other annexation plans continue to move forward. So unfortunately, the fact that these countries that recognized Palestine were obviously only allowed to recognize the Palestinian Authority. And at this point, we know that Israel has even debanked and effectively ended the Palestinian Authority. We haven't heard too many updates from them, but as far as I'm aware, Fatah may no longer exist by the end of this year unless Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or someone else can come in and help them. Because we know it finally took open discussion and the beginning of West Bank annexation for the UAE to even lift a single finger of objection to what Israel is doing. So unless you have any other updates about Palestine or obviously the other news from the UN General Assembly, it's a huge, huge story. We're probably going to keep touching base with what was said and as it is ongoing throughout this episode. But the other big announcement regarding Israel-Palestine is the Iranian cooperation with the IAEA. Supposedly, they have allowed certain inspections on their new sites, but are not allowing the IAEA anywhere near or even to know where their, supposed hundreds and hundreds of kilograms of enriched uranium is. They've apparently started taking it up to 90% enrichment. And the Ayatollah recently made a big statement about how, the Iranian Islamic Republic isn't seeking nuclear weapons, but this enriched uranium is used for all sorts of other things. Obviously, everyone knows the subtext of this. They're maintaining their status as a threshold nuclear power to the point where even if more attacks were done, it's ambiguous whether or not they would be able to develop a nuclear weapon in an extremely short amount of time. Ali Khamenei, he said, the speech was delivered yesterday on September 23rd. He said, now he, the U.S. president, says that enrichment must be terminated. But just a few days ago, one of their officials stated that Iran should not even possess medium-range or short-range missiles, meaning that Iran's hands should be so tied that if it were attacked, it could not even respond to U.S. bases. The Iranian leader reaffirmed that Tehran does not seek nuclear weapons, comments that came after some Iranian MPs called for a reassessment of his ban on the development of nukes. I believe it was 71 members of the Iranian Majlis wrote a letter to Khamenei asking for a removal of the restriction on nuclear weapons and insisting that they do go nuclear. He says, we're the ones who don't have a nuclear bomb and we won't have one. We have no intention of using nuclear weapons, but we do have enrichment. The counterpart has threatened that if you do not negotiate, such and such will occur. Therefore, accepting such negotiations signifies submission, fear, and trembling, a surrender of the nation and the country in the face of threats. So he's effectively saying that there will be no further negotiations with the United States. They also accused the EU of violating the JCPOA as they have initiated snapback sanctions against Iran. So those European sanctions are moving forward. And I think we're going to have to wait and see how much of an effect that has on the Iranian economy. Another big story from the Middle East this week was a father and 3 children were killed by Israel. And a few of them even had U.S. citizenship and were living in the United States. So Israel, many, many times, despite the fact that we had such a huge hullabaloo over a few of the hostages were technically American citizens. At this point, Israel has killed far more Palestinian and Lebanese and Syrian American citizens in their multi-pronged, massive regional war that they have been engaging in for, at this point, multiple years. We're getting close to the 2-year anniversary of October 7th, which we all pretty much, at this point, I don't think we need to keep referring to it as October 7th. It's just the beginning of the greater Israel genocidal war, which I think is what history will know this era and call the current conflict. That will be the name in the history books, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And I think providentially, all of these crimes by the Talmudic tribe are being so well documented that no matter what kind of they cry as they strike you, theory or hypothesis they come up at the end of all this, the evidence will be ironclad against them. And again, the voices of the innocents are crying out for not just retribution, I think primarily for some accountability, for at least the nation to be held culpable and liable for what it has done. In this particular nation state, this creation of the British Empire controlled by Freemasons, and its, of course, Talmudic leader is literally the city of London, this particular country, Israel. And that family, Conrad, they look incredibly angelic in like that one photograph. It's one of some of the saddest news because you look at their faces and they look, and this is not your typical Middle Eastern family. These people look European, literally. Like the young girl is blonde. The dad looks like, he looks like a Russian or like a Serbian. You could mistake him for any, this just looks like a happy family. Of course, some of them had American citizenship, etc. Absolutely sad. And out of the 4 children, the 2 of them that died were twins, aged 1.5 years. And so, of course, the Israeli warplane was aiming at the front of a certain building, and then I guess the warplane hit their family car, and they were all in it. The mother and one of the daughters, they're in hospital right now. The surviving members of the family, and they were grievously wounded, burnt, of course, by the explosion. So it's just very bizarre. And all of this, of course, just happened this week, and just after a very interesting address by Khamenei in relation to the nuclear program, as you said, but also the leader of Hezbollah, Naim Qassem, the Secretary General of Hezbollah in Lebanon. He openly called actually Saudi Arabia, and he said, look, our Sunni cousins, you need to unite against Israel. It needs to be a common front. The axis of resistance needs to expand. It's a very interesting call for collaboration by Naim Qassem. I think it's almost like one of the first times we've heard him actively promoting some sort of united front. Again, the Saudis, I doubt they're going to align here. Remember, even their reaction to the bombing of Doha a week and a half ago was quite soft, to say the least. And yes, the Qatari emir, actually, essentially the de facto king of Qatar, is giving a speech. Gave a speech yesterday, actually, at the UN, condemning Israel and condemning the crossing of, the way Israel just crosses national boundaries without any respect for international law and the rules-based international order, as well as the genocide in Gaza. But all this rhetoric, and we know that Qatar was one of the nations responsible for fueling and funding via its oil and gas sales the civil war in Syria that has taken the lives of millions of people. And literally, I think the Syrian population was cut in half, if I'm not mistaken, not just due to death and starvation, malnutrition, and terrorism, but due to the emigration, the people just seeking refuge abroad. So the Syrian population, the land is depopulated because of Qatar's actions. So it's not hypocritical, and it's not whataboutism. It's just we need to view this through a certain lens. And it's very unfortunate that all the nations that are now speaking up in favor of Palestine don't have the cleanest moral or ethical record themselves. In fact, you could almost call them culpable themselves and being involved in all this. So it's very bizarre. Obviously, Israel, not only is it trying to set up some sort of Camp David Accords with Syria, but it's very clear to me, Conrad, especially with Trump calling together this new Arab summit, and of course him and Erdogan actually leading it, which is quite curious because, again, we spoke about how Erdogan, his recent rhetoric against Israel, as well as the setting up of the steel dome over Turkey with the air defense systems. And I'm sure Qatar, we have to keep in mind, Qatar, Doha, and Ankara are allies politically. They're both nations have open support for the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood, you could almost call it this counter-axis of resistance. And these two nations have the biggest Muslim Brotherhood bases. It's a very interesting connection, again. And the fact that Trump is now so openly working with Erdogan, it causes this confusing triangle of interests. So Trump, who is clearly very friendly with Chabad Lubavitch, very friendly with Jared Kushner, friendly with essentially the entire Talmudic Zionist lobby inside of his own administration, who he himself invited in. It wasn't like it was forced upon him. He won the election and knowingly invited Zionists as well as just direct members of the Talmudic tribe into his own ruling family, so to speak. And it's very obvious that he's not anti-Israel. Erdogan, again, rhetorically, he's anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, but on paper, he's still supplying, and he's allowing his neighbor Azerbaijan to supply Israel with not just military and arms, but also gas, oil, and anything else Azerbaijan can possibly export, including fruits and other things from nearby Georgia and Armenia. So Azerbaijan has been supplying all this to Israel exponentially and almost increasing since the 7th of October. It's very curious, Conrad, this hypocritical triangle, and all of this, and Turkey is gaining, of course, in Syria, gaining a benefit. It's almost as if the anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist rhetoric is clearly a shield. It's a guise. It's a disguise that's used by the Turks to just position themselves as potential future caretakers. If something was to happen to Israel, if Israel was to fall apart politically and the Jews would have to seek exodus abroad, which country would move in to have custodianship over the holy place as well? What nation ruled the land for hundreds of years prior to the arrival of the British and the French and of course, the Israeli migrants? It was the Turks. If we even recall, you can Google actually a photograph of Emperor Wilhelm of Prussia and all of Germany. Actually, the one time he visited Jerusalem was because the Ottoman Empire, the Caliph, and the Sultan of Istanbul actually allowed Emperor Wilhelm and the German delegation to visit the holy places. And there's some pretty cool photos of German imperial leaders actually visiting Jerusalem, which harkens back to the Crusades perhaps, but it's the very interesting cooperation. The Turks, they use Jerusalem as a big political tool in their, in the way they collaborated and worked with Europeans, especially with Christian nations in the past. And I think they want to take control of that again. But at the moment, obviously the chips and all the world power is in the hands of this very radicalized and now very powerful in the Middle East. They have an air force which cannot be matched by any other country in the Middle East. And they have all the power, essentially, especially when they're backed by the US and they're backed by the Trump administration. And now with Trump's anti-Russia rhetoric, you can almost guarantee, Conrad, that NATO is going to stay the course and they're going to continue to support Ukraine. So it's not like Trump is going to turn into a dove all of a sudden. And when we pivot to, of course, Russia, Ukraine, we'll discuss the huge Ashkenazi Hasidic migration that's currently taking place, the religious pilgrimage. Tens of thousands of Jews around the world are visiting Uman and visiting all the Jewish settlements in Odessa, etc., for Rosh Hashanah celebration in 2025, amidst an unprecedented drone attack by both the Russians and the Ukrainians, respectively. So pretty crazy times we live in.
Not only are the Jews storming Ukraine for Rosh Hashanah, but record amounts of Jews, even this year and specifically this week, have stormed the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa. They are, of course, these are members of radical groups. Obviously, Chabad Lubavitch has a big overlap with these people, but these are, big Temple Institute members. This says here from Middle Eastern Eye, hundreds of ultranationalist Israelis stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque and occupied East Jerusalem on Tuesday, coinciding with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Groups of settlers enter the mosque complex under the protection of heavily armed Israeli forces. They openly performed Jewish prayers and religious rituals at the site. They also sang and danced. These actions violate long-standing international agreements. Returning to the Temple Mount, an Israeli group that organizes many of these incursions had called on its supporters to carry out mass raids between 22nd and 24th of September in an effort to break records for the number of settlers entering the site. Ultranationalist groups reported that 58,310 settlers stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque over the course of the past Hebrew year, marking a 14% increase compared to the previous year and a five-fold increase compared to a decade ago. Temple Mount groups advocate for the destruction of Al-Aqsa Mosque to build a third Jewish temple in its place. There are also tunnels, we believe, and actually pretty much have been confirmed under Al-Aqsa Mosque. There was even rumors that some of the pictures that Netanyahu was taking with the visiting delegation were in those exact tunnels. So, Jewish New Year, a lot of Jewish holidays. Stay safe out there. Keep an eye on your children. Don't wind up in any seedy areas where these people are, lest you fall victim to their evil magic. But a big interview, and we've reported on a few of these. What is this, our third or fourth report on the bombastic interviews of everyone's favorite special envoy to Syria and Turkey, Tom Barak, who, as far as I can tell, is pretty much the only Gentile that is allowed within the U.S. government to sort of criticize Israel. And in this interview, it was given to The National. Obviously, Barak is himself part Lebanese, so maybe that's where some of his sympathies lie. But this says here, in a wide-ranging 23-minute interview published on Monday, Barak described peace in the region as an illusion and said that Israel was attacking everybody, including Syria, Lebanon, and Tunisia, which I think is a reference to Israeli drones interfering with the Gaza flotilla convoy, which Greta Thunberg and any of these other people are on once again. And apparently the flotilla is being harassed by drones. Their communications are being scrambled by the Israelis, and apparently ABBA music, like Mamma Mia, is being spammed through their speakers and communications so they can't communicate with one another. So very interesting Israeli tactics here. But Barak went on to say that Israel's strike on Qatar earlier this month was not good, adding that groups like Hamas and the Taliban were in Doha at America's request. He went on to say, President Trump brilliantly said, look, I'm not going to lose any more American lives. We've been there. I'm not going to take over any more countries and try to teach them the colonial method. It never worked. But then he goes on, Israel is a different story. Israel is a valued ally. We subsidize them for $4 or $5 billion a year. It has a special place in America's heart. And we're living with the confusion of what's happening in this transition. So obviously, as much as there are some harsh words for Israel because they're literally attacking U.S. allies like Qatar, they're continuing the genocide in Gaza, it fundamentally all comes back to that special place that Israel has in America's heart that everybody references and is only really able to be maintained because of the evangelical base that, Donald Trump has perpetuated. He went on to say, this is from Middle Eastern Eye, in a section of the interview talking about the situation in Lebanon, Barak was asked what the incentive was for Hezbollah to disarm. He replied, 0. This is the problem, especially when Israel is attacking everybody. So Israel is attacking Syria. Israel is attacking Lebanon. Israel is attacking Tunisia, he continued. He was referring to the frequent Israeli strikes across Syria since Bashar al-Assad's government fell in December, and the near-daily Israeli breaches of the ceasefire agreed in Lebanon in November. As for Tunisia, Barak was likely referring to a suspected drone strike on the global Samud flotilla. As it goes on, Hezbollah's arguments get better and better. We're here to protect the Lebanese from Israel. Israel has 5 points that it still occupies in Lebanon and is not withdrawing, Barak added. Elsewhere in the discussion about Lebanon, Barak repeatedly said that it was on the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah. We'll give our advice, we'll help, but they've got to solve it, he said. The Lebanese government, if they want to get back on track, he says, we're going to disarm Hezbollah. He described the Lebanese armed forces, which he shortened to LAF, as well-meaning but not well-equipped. Because who are they going to fight? We don't want to arm them so they can fight Israel? I don't think so, the special envoy said. So you're arming them so they can fight their own people, Hezbollah. Hezbollah is our enemy. Iran is our enemy. We need to cut the heads off of those snakes and chop the flow of funds. That's the only way we're going to stop Hezbollah. So, obviously, it's clear to me that the United States and the West would much prefer the dialectic to be between radical Israeli Zionists and then these more Sunni-focused Muslim Brotherhood groups, because Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, these are U.S. allies. These are countries that if Israel attacked them, obviously with this Qatar attack, the U.S. is going to have a much bigger problem than Israel attacking Lebanon, Syria, and of course Iran. And it's very obvious that the Shia axis of resistance and the Shia force and their faction against Israel is much more dangerous and much less controlled by any intelligence agencies or Western groups. So we have to recognize that as much as Turkey and these other countries are supposedly standing up to Israel, and yes, Qatar hosts Hamas, it's very clear that they are never going to be willing to confront Israel to the level of Iran, largely because they have not been pushed to the brink by the United States. Turkey's a NATO member. Egypt needs America to stand up against Ethiopia. Trump recently made a comment about Ethiopia's massive dam and how it's draining the Nile and how he isn't happy about it. And of course, Qatar is the site of CENTCOM. It's one of the places where the largest U.S. bases is. So clearly the U.S. has picked a side in the intra-Muslim conflict, and it is not with the Iranian Shias. But speaking of Turkey and Syria, this is a big headline from the Cradle. It says Turkey, Syria, and Jordan agree to restore historic railway corridor. Turkish Transport and Infrastructure Minister Abdulkadir Ulaloglu announced on the 23rd of September that Turkey, Syria, and Jordan agreed to revive the Hejaz Railway, the Ottoman era line, once stretching 1,750 kilometers from Istanbul to the Islamic holy sites of Mecca and Medina. The historic Hejaz Railway is being reviewed, Ulaloglu declared, describing the outcome of a tripartite meeting in Amman earlier this month. He confirmed that the three sides have prepared a draft memorandum of understanding covering full cooperation on transport infrastructure. Turkey is committed to finishing 30 kilometers of missing superstructure on the Syrian stretch of the line. Jordan will evaluate its technical ability to repair and operate locomotives inside Syrian territory. Joint technical studies are also planned to create a corridor from Turkey through Syria into Jordan, granting access to the Red Sea via the port of Aqaba. While preserving our region's historical heritage, we are also establishing strong cooperation in international transport corridors. Together, these developments underscore how Turkey, Syria, and Jordan are repositioning their cooperation with the Hejaz project, standing as both a symbol of Ottoman-era continuity and a practical step toward renewed integration. So if you pair this with the Zangezur corridor that, of course, Turkey, with U.S. help, is building through the southern part of Armenia, connecting the Nakhchivan exclave of Azerbaijan to the rest of Azerbaijan, and thus the Caspian Sea and the rest of Turkic Central Asia, it's very clear that Turkey is advancing rapidly on its neo-Ottoman project and is both with infrastructure and with military cooperation with the Syrian government, for example, and of course its close ally Azerbaijan, is really, really beefing up and arming Russia's southern flank. And I don't know if the Russians are going to come out with any more news about this or address this any further, but as anti-Azerbaijani and even anti-Turkic sentiment, I think, is finally starting to grow, not just in Russia proper, but in the higher echelons of the Russian elite. And of course, we might have to discuss this a little bit later, but Turkey this week claimed at least half of a bunch of Aegean islands, maybe 3, if not more, these Aegean islands that belong to Greece. So Turkey is continuing to escalate its rhetoric. And I remember in New York City, we actually saw those big screen trucks that people often commission to protest political figures when they come to New York for the UN General Assembly, talking about how we need to free Imamoglu, pressuring the U.S. to put pressure on Erdogan and how he needs to be overthrown. And as I've said in the past, I will not be surprised if as Turkey and these other Sunni Muslim Brotherhood-aligned powers become more relevant in their resistance to Israel, and if, as Iran and the Shia axis is potentially weakened more, Turkey emerges as Israel's number one enemy, we would see Israeli and even potentially United States and other pushes for Imamoglu not only to be freed from prison, but to be installed as the president and to overthrow Erdogan in an election or even some kind of color revolution. So unless you have anything else to say about Turkey, Dimitri, we'll have to maybe circle back to the Turkey-Greece thing later, but we also need to discuss Russia and Ukraine, because Trump made some very unfortunate announcements recently, and there are also major frontline updates. But feel free to reflect on the other news I just laid down.
Conrad, that's exactly right. Donald Trump, in his recent, and this is less than 24 hours old at the time of the recording of this episode, statement in relation to the Ukraine-Russia peace negotiations, has stated very openly that essentially, because the negotiations are going nowhere, and I'm paraphrasing him in summary, the US will continue, and of course its European allies will continue to provide aid to Ukraine, and Ukraine, of course, can carry out military actions in the correct ways they deem necessary. He also essentially mentioned that Ukraine, in its objectives, will sort of move on to take its previously occupied territories, such as Crimea, and especially the east, Donetsk, Lugansk. Again, is this Trump or his staff are sort of sending this particular message? Obviously, he's dictating it. But is Trump sort of going off of some of the reports he may have just read, for example, in relation to the mineral deal, Conrad, which we discussed heaps of times, that essentially it's the so-called Russian-occupied lands, as the West calls it, in the East, which have a majority of those same minerals that Ukraine essentially signed on with in its deal with America recently. And by the way, the Ukrainian budget just came out, and it's in a massive deficit. I believe it's $14.5 billion US American dollars, and the budget doesn't even account for international aid being provided to Ukraine. Almost the entire budget is militarized. And at this point, we can almost say, and I have to agree with Alexei Arestovich, the former advisor to President Zelensky, that Ukraine has lost its sovereignty entirely, not just militarily in terms of it takes direct orders from NATO officials inside of the city of Kiev, and they, of course, advise Syrsky on how to conduct battle plans, and how to, of course, operationally, strategically involve the Ukrainian defense of their so-called lands in the east, but specifically economically, like Ukraine militarily and economically now has completely lost its sovereignty. But what's interesting is Erdogan and some of the other leaders who've been interviewed again this week in their comments about Ukraine, because it's not just Gaza that they've been talking about. So Erdogan has said, this is, again, he's somewhat critical of Europe here. He says, I don't really believe that the war in Ukraine will end soon. That is bad news. From a financial standpoint, it is especially clear that Ukraine is not capable of competing with Russia. We must also take into account Europe's role. I don't think Europe will be able to provide economic assistance to Ukraine forever. The support is being given now despite great difficulties. We hope it will continue. As for the US, I don't think it will last for much longer. I cannot assess exactly how long this support will be provided. So Erdogan, again, sort of spelling an eventual end to the funneling of funds to the Ukraine. Of course, it's going completely unaccounted for. Essentially, it's a big corruption scheme. But Erdogan's comments in relation to Europe, Conrad, should be assessed, I think, in the scope of, as you said, the Turkey-Greek confrontation, because, again, Greece is one of the recipients of that European IMF EU aid. Of course, Greece is entirely bankrupt at this point and has been for more than a decade now, since the 2007-2008 financial crisis. But one of the other really key comments actually came from one of Russia's BRICS allies in relation to Ukraine. And this is sort of surprising because it goes against President Putin's comments on the SMO, right? The special military operations objectives have not been met yet. And clearly they can only be met through militarized, shall we call it, hyper-policing means, right, of Ukrainian territories, which is what President Putin has set from the beginning in February 2022. President of Brazil, Lula da Silva, so this is the B in BRICS, has openly said that everyone already understands, and this is at the UN General Assembly, by the way, everyone already understands that there will be no military solution to the conflict in Ukraine, completely counter-signaling his economic partner in the face of President Putin himself, who, of course, wasn't present at New York to give this presentation because President Putin was actually busy this week. And this is when we're really pivoting to the combat news, because there's been huge military exercises carried out. They commenced, of course, last week, and they've gone on for a few days, immense. And I mean, again, these exercises, Zapad 2025, of course, or the West 2025, as it would be called in English, can only be compared to Zapad 2021. But the 2021 program, which I think it took place at the end of the year, so just a few months before the SMO, it involved at least 200,000 Russian military reservists, as well as almost the entire base of Russian conscripts, people who've signed military contracts, so professional military servicemen. So 200,000 people participated in 2021. This year, estimates range between 100 and 120,000 Russians who are not on the front line. So these are reservists. In some way, President Putin, by showing all of Europe, and of course with collaboration from Belarus as well. Belarus, out of its 65,000 strong army, which it's not that large, but you have to keep in mind Belarus is smaller than Poland, for example. By population, it's bigger than the Baltic states, but still, its overall army is 65,000 men. Belarus provided 13,000, and most of the training actually took place just west of Minsk in the city of Borisov, which used to be a huge Polish military base. And then when Germany moved eastwards during World War II, actually Borisov was used as an Abwehr base as well by the German Third Reich. So it's a very huge polygon. There's actually lots of training grounds. And Putin himself openly said that 41 different training facilities around Russia, all the way from Nizhny Novgorod, from the Volga to Borisov in the west. And even Kaliningrad was involved because 2 Russian navies participated, 247 ships, including, of course, the Northern Fleet, so that's the Arctic Fleet, and the Baltic Sea Fleet. And recall, Kaliningrad is the Russian island, essentially, of course, surrounded by Lithuania, Poland on one end, and with no connection to Russia or Belarus. This is where the Suwalki corridor comes in, and all the other speculation which we spoke about years prior in relation to potentially Wagner being able to secure that in the near future if there is a war between Russia and NATO. And actually, Russian political commentators were mentioning just during these training exercises, these huge displays of power. President Putin essentially showed not just the Baltic states, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland itself, all those countries neighboring Russia in the northwest, that Russia has a second army, literally waiting in the wings in case NATO gets a little bit too trigger happy. And not just that, but the political commentators mentioned that Russia has officially already, more than a year ago now at this point, has provided, or close to a year, has provided nuclear warheads to Belarus. And by the way, we know Belarus has Oreshnik missile systems, for example, that can shoot these missiles thousands of kilometers away. But we also know Belarus has Iskander missile launchers. And an Iskander with a nuclear warhead can shoot up to 500 kilometers. So that doesn't sound that very far, except that it's perfect if you want to hit one of the Baltic countries or if you want to strike at Poland. So an Iskander with a nuclear warhead is what the Russian political commentators are saying on television is the main threat. So, of course, giving nuclear warheads to Belarus to be positioned on Belarusian land is a direct threat to those very close nearby NATO countries, which, of course, have been promoting Russophobia for so long on a cultural sort of political level that, it's not even funny at this point. And again, they're trying to agitate the Russians very much. And it's very clear from those drone attacks around Poland. And just the recent drone attack actually has been entirely unprecedented. Every week we say that the drone attacks have been getting more and more extreme. But just in the last 48 hours, at least 450 Ukrainian drones have been spotted. Many of them, the majority, have been shot down over all kinds of Russian oblasts. Reports range of how many drones actually flew towards Moscow. Apparently, on the journey towards Moscow through European Russia, 46 Ukrainian drones made it a certain distance, some of which apparently were blown up just outside of Moscow or on the outskirts of it. But that's incredibly horrific. Like, the Ukrainians are really escalating, pushing the envelope now that they have, the support of the Trump administration, which before, Conrad, unfortunately for the Ukrainians and Zelensky's administration, there was a big question mark, and with J.D. Vance, et cetera. Now, if Trump supports Zelensky and his campaign to push further and to destroy the Russians, I wonder what that would mean essentially for the church, for the Orthodox Church there, for the efforts. There's really major concerns. But in terms of progression on the front lines, the Russians have been making huge moves, specifically not just in Pokrovsk, where the Russians have been, of course, occupying a majority of the buildings in the center and actually holding the line. They've been essentially operationally surrounded, but also in 2 other areas. So if you look at a map of the front lines in the Donetsk Oblast, you'll notice there's this Russian-like stalagmite sort of needle pointing out between Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. So on the left side, you have Mirnograd, Pokrovsk. On the right, you have Konstantinovka. And this is that Zolotoy Kolodets, Golden Well, Kucherov Yar, Russian stalagmite almost position. Now they're surrounded on 3 sides, left, right, and forward by Ukrainians. 2 Russian brigades at least, so a few thousand Russian soldiers fighting off the Ukrainians from all angles. And they've been holding out there at the Golden Well, Kucherov Yar position for just a few weeks now. Absolutely incredible sort of 300 Spartans type standing by the Russians. Very impressive, in fact. And the Ukrainians tried, they have their own little version of this. This is near Chasov Yar, actually. There's a thing called a reservoir, essentially, of water, a very small reservoir called the Kliban Byk Vodokharanilisha. And the Ukrainians have a very small position. It's like almost a little line on the map. And a few hundred Ukrainians are actually holding off in this area for more than a month now with almost no support. So they're completely cut off. They're surrounded by the Russians, but they're still holding off. And they're receiving, apparently, the Ukrainians are passing on some information that they're receiving food, water, and ammunition via drones. So these drones flying in at night, they carry, for example, a bottle of water or a package of, and this is how these surrounded positions are able to receive sustenance. It's very bizarre and quite strange. But the other progression point, Conrad, was, of course, Kupiansk. So the Russians now, and this is, of course, these are estimates from the Russian sources, but they occupy 5,000 out of the 8,000 buildings in Kupiansk. So huge progress, more than 51% of the city, right? So huge progression. Kupiansk is falling into Russian hands almost directly, almost entirely surrounded. There's still an escape route for any Ukrainians who want to leave, which, again, we promote these innocent Ukrainians who've been drafted forcibly and mobilized into the Ukrainian military to, of course, make their exit while they still can, or at least put down their weapons and surrender to the Russians, because we know POWs are treated with respect, at least in the Russian prisoner of war camps. But specifically in Kupiansk, the Russians captured an entire suburb by, again, using the pipeline strategy. It's the third time. So earlier this year, we, of course, saw last year, actually, we saw the Avdiivka pipeline strategy work. Then, of course, we saw the Sudzha pipeline, and now the Kupiansk pipeline. The Russians are actually using the pipeline strategy. So these are old gas pipelines, and they're using them for essentially troop mobilization and transportation across the battlefield. Or not across it, correctly put, under the battlefield. Why? Because in this war, notice, unlike in Iraq or Afghanistan or in other battlefields, even all the way going back to World War II, when you could drop troops from the air into specific strategic locations, when there are swarms of drones flying around, and only it takes one drone to take down an entire helicopter or a plane, right? Even easier. It's not safe anymore to transport troops and to drop them from the air. So in Ukraine, the most gasified country in the entire Soviet Union, with many of these offline gas pipes, you can take the battle underground. And so, in fact, the Russians have used the gas assault approach for underground in these, subterranean, abandoned industrial locations at least 3 times. But we've also heard reports that the Russian military has actually a strategy of, if they entrench themselves in a position, they can dig under the enemy's position almost 200 meters forward. So not for kilometers, but the Russians do have mole-like tactics in order to advance their front line. So completely incredible, obviously very hard. And when they do dig, they actually promote artillery fire at the enemy's position in order to mask the sound of machinery underground working, digging, fixing some of these pipelines. And yeah, it's just completely insane. So Kupiansk has been taken, but I would be remiss not to mention the other big progress. Now, Russians are currently 45 kilometers exactly away from Zaporozhye. So on the borders of the Dnieper River, all the way in the west. This is the most westernmost Russian progress point, you can almost say, in central Ukraine. Probably the scariest one as well, because Zaporozhye at this point has never been taken by Russia. Of course, the town of Stepnogorsk. The Russians have captured the high-rise buildings. The south of the town has been taken. And this town, by the way, the Russians are approaching it from the south, of course, and along the coast, the Dnieper coast. And the commander of the Russian forces there is actually Major General Tseplinsky and his Vostok group. So, and apparently they're not that heavily, armed. As compared to the Russian forces in Donetsk, taking Pokrovsk, bombing Konstantinovka, for example, or taking Kupiansk, there's hundreds of thousands of Russians there. But in Stepnogorsk, which is only 45 kilometers away from Zaporozhye, Tseplinsky's army is doing that with minimal support and reinforcements. And the Ukrainians are getting extremely agitated because Stepnogorsk has never been taken by the Russians. So this is fresh, sort of virgin land, which is now falling and being liberated by the Russians, whilst Ukraine is losing, of course, control over every single other front line. And this week, specifically, which villages has Russia captured? Well, apparently none in Donetsk and Lugansk, but specifically 3 villages just to the west of Velikaya Novoselovka in the Dnipropetrovsk region. So as we said, Conrad, a few weeks ago, Dnipropetrovsk, it doesn't fall within the scope of the special military operation, but the Russians are still progressing into an entirely new oblasts. And the Ukrainians are, they're not seeing any success on almost any single front line. The Russians are taking this advance very seriously. And amidst all of this, there's this weird rhetoric coming out of the UN, all of these, quasi-American partners saying and proclaiming that, well, there couldn't be no military solution to the war in Ukraine, when clearly a military solution is currently being cooked up on the front lines, and the Russians are executing it in a very sort of well-put fashion. I would say 2025 has been a year of military success, if anything.
No, it's true. The Russians are obviously continuing to advance, but as we are recording this, of course, the Ukrainians launched a huge drone attack on Novorossiysk and some of the Russian naval bases on the coast down in the south of Russia. We're seeing some big explosions, so be sure to check out the World War Now Telegram to keep up with this. Obviously, as I said earlier, there was that huge attack on Moscow the other night. I didn't hear anything. I think all of the drones were shot down on the outskirts of the city before they could reach anything. Sheremetyevo Airport had to be closed for 4 hours. We saw planes having to fly very low, close to the buildings to avoid some of these drones. So things are very much escalating right now. And before we completely forget about Turkey in the rearview mirror, we of course have to address the recent supposed drone and plane violations over Estonia and Poland by Russia. The Russians have, of course, denied this, but NATO Article 4 was activated by a multiple of these countries. Trump told the countries that he thinks they should shoot down any Russian planes that violate their airspace. And on a Fox News interview with Bret Baier, Turkish President Erdogan, he said, I think NATO could use Turkey's model that we use both with Russia and Ukraine. This was after being asked about what NATO should do about Russian incursions into NATO airspace. And of course, people remember in 2015, Turkey shot down Russian planes. So Turkey is apparently siding with the United States, thinking that these countries should be shooting down Russian planes if they violate their airspace, despite the fact that the Russians denied this. But referencing, of course, the Aegean Sea and everything going on there, obviously, I believe that Greece is currently in the Israeli camp in a lot of ways. Israel is actually helping Greece defend against preemptive Turkish aggression. But recently a map was posted. Erdogan's main nationalist ally, Devlet Bahçeli, they were holding a map showing almost all of the Aegean islands and even Crete included in Turkey. And there were other maps released showing at least half the Aegean islands by more official Turkish sources claimed by Turkey. So it's clear that Turkey is perhaps using the support it's getting internationally for standing against Israel to continue to move against Greece, who obviously is now a total puppet to the EU and the West and thus has to stand with Israel. But if you think about the prophecies, obviously, we know that they say that the Turks will seize some Greek islands. There will be a sort of political turmoil in Greece that will cause all of the corrupt politicians to leave or to be thrown out of office. And I think at the same time, we could easily see whether this happens before or after. If Erdogan is perhaps still in power when the moves are made on these islands, there will be a domestic uprising. The West and the US will foment a color revolution. Imamoglu will take power potentially. And then, at this point, we would have a NATOist Turkey who is then willing to confront Russia with a Greece who at this point potentially has left NATO due to the fact that NATO did not stand up against Turkey for invading those Greek islands. So I think that's a very plausible way, for example, in which we get the prophetic reality where Russia and Turkey are clashing, NATO on the side of Turkey, and we see Russia returning Constantinople to Greece as a sort of neutral third party, largely due to perhaps Russia being incapable of holding a large city like Constantinople. So that's our sort of prophetic breakdown. But of course, Dimitri, you mentioned Donald Trump openly saying that Ukraine can reclaim its 1991 borders, including Crimea. I have absolutely no idea why he thinks that is possible. Of course, the initial speculation is this is just bellicose rhetoric in response to the major Russian gains that have been made, trying to make himself not look weak. But obviously the only way that Ukraine would be able to retake Crimea would be, I think, with direct troop involvements from NATO and major weapon supplies, not deals where Ukraine buys weapons, but free, in-kind donations of large amounts of ammunition and weapons. So that is clearly what's going on in Ukraine right now. Again, we're keeping updated on these drone strikes in the south and what else potentially could be coming down the pipe there. But we are currently in the midst of the Moldovan elections, and we're hearing reports of dozens, even like 75 supposed Russian agents in Moldova arrested. This comes amidst the huge crackdown on the church. I encourage everybody to listen to our latest episode of Ether Hour. It is completely free. We gave up any kind of monetary gains we could have made from that episode. So if you enjoyed that episode, please consider getting behind the paywall, because when we give the free content, it really lowers the incentive for people to get behind the paywall, and we usually gain a few paid subscribers every week. So be sure to check it out. It's going to be linked below. We break down all the news about the persecution in Moldova. I was there myself. I spoke to parishioners. I spoke to old babushkas and priests, people that have been assaulted, people that have been surveilled, people that have been threatened by the secret police and the government. So be sure to check that episode out, all about Moldova. We talked with Archbishop Markel, who, of course, is currently appealing to J.D. Vance. We might talk about that a little bit more in the church news section. But obviously, right now, the elections are ongoing. And if the current ruling party solidifies its gains, Moldova will continue to drift away from the Russian sphere of influence. And of course, Moldova is relevant because Pridnestrovia, Transnistria, is right near Odessa. And of course, if Russia is able to take the Black Sea coast, they would be able to connect with this self-declared independent region of Moldova. I've been there recently. I went to Tiraspol and Transnistria, and I loved it. It was a beautiful place. So check out my social media if you want to see any pictures or videos from there. But obviously, Moldova continuing to drift away from Russia is not a good sign. It seems that the goal is that only Belarus and even the few parts of Ukraine that Russia has taken will be allowed in the Russian sphere of influence for no other reason than Russia has put its troops there. So anywhere that Russia hasn't actually physically, militarily invaded, the West is trying to push the wall of NATO, the European Union, and Western aggression right up until that point, which proves that they haven't learned a single lesson about why Russia went into Ukraine in the first place. And unfortunately, it appears that they are willing to escalate to the point where the Russians may be forced to enter other parts of Eastern Europe, which obviously the media is constantly fomenting threats. Zelensky is saying that Putin is looking for weak points to invade Poland, the Baltics, and other places, which obviously we know that they're not. The Russians aren't even going as hard as they need to be in Ukraine right now, as far as these podcast hosts are concerned. So the only reason that Russia will, and I believe it is very likely in the future, be forced to enter Europe or perhaps be forced to defend itself from Europe is because the West is pushing and pushing and pushing. Of course, Sweden and Finland entering NATO was one escalation of this. Now, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland being told to shoot down Russian planes is the next step. And of course, I believe as of now, the Polish-Belarusian border has been reopened, but it had been closed ever since those supposed, and as I say, likely even fake or false flag Russian violations of Polish airspace occurred. So I guess now the Polish-Belarusian border is now open. But Dmitry, I'd love to hear any final thoughts you have on Russia-Ukraine, on Russia-Turkey, on any of the prophecies that are to come down the pike, because obviously St. Philomenos saying that the Russians will make it down to Mount Tabor, that becomes more and more relevant as Turkey continues to expand its military and other infrastructure projects within Syria, within the Caucasus, where we know Russia, I think, is going to be forced to act sooner than they might think, as their strategists are unfortunately not as prophecy-pilled as us here on the show, and of course, our now very well-informed audience. So before we move on to Venezuela, Southeast Asia, and these other smaller World War III conflicts, Dmitry, what are your final thoughts on Russia, Ukraine, the future of the conflict, Trump's recent comments, and, the whole Turkish prophetic element?
I think first and foremost, the prophetic element is not just present, but for example, the recent Ukrainian attack on Novorossiysk, just for reference, when the Russians were actually close to liberating Istanbul, Constantinople in 1917, actually so Nicholas II, St. Nicholas II, the Tsar at the time, has already issued orders for the Black Sea operation because the Turkish Black Sea fleet was already destroyed. So Admiral Alexander Kolchak was supposed to organize and conduct a essentially amphibious naval raid on Constantinople and capture the city around, I believe it was probably May or June of 1917. And of course, the February Revolution, which we have a fairly detailed article about, and exactly how the Bolsheviks were involved in that particular Masonic liberal revolution in Russia on our Substack, worth reading. Admiral Kolchak, his operation was, of course, cut short because of the alleged abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and that entire fiasco that took place in February and March. So the Russian Black Sea Fleet is key, Conrad, in relation to the prophecy. Now, what happened just in the last 24 hours, or even just several hours ago as we're recording the episode? Novorossiysk is attacked, and that's where the entire Black Sea Fleet is located. In fact, the Black Sea Fleet was moved eastwards to Novorossiysk specifically to prepare it, and of course arm it with anti-drone technological, and this is just my assumption, obviously this is top secret naval intelligence in Russia. Obviously the Russian Marines, by the way, are actually fighting in Pokrovsk at the moment. So Russian Navy officers, the Marines, those who of course, the infantry of the Navy are actually participating actively in land attacks now, or at least they're receiving military experience actively on the front lines. And not actually, Russian ships are not doing anything. In fact, they're being renovated. And if Russia would go to war against Turkey, and Turkey, by the way, is reinforcing its Navy right now, Conrad, it will be with those same ships that the Ukrainians are trying to attack in Novorossiysk, with a combination of course, the aerial drones as well as these new submarine drones that now both Russia and Ukraine is. By the way, these are not clearly Ukrainian drones. These are British-made submarine sort of torpedo-type drones, which they're using to try and sabotage the Russian Navy station in Novorossiysk. So extremely concerning, because these are the same ships which probably will be actively personally participating in those same prophetic occurrences, as per St. Paisios and other Greek Orthodox Christian elders have foretold in the near future. And I have no doubt about that. So it's very interesting. So this Russian Black Sea Fleet needs to stay afloat, literally speaking, in order for, I think, certain things to transpire. Otherwise, of course, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, simply the Russians cannot take it by land. They need an active Black Sea Fleet, because the Baltic Fleet cannot loop around through the Mediterranean and the Gibraltar. That's just not going to happen. NATO will never allow that to happen. So it's very key. What happens on the Black Sea, we follow it very closely because it has direct correlation with essentially the Russian progression down south and this Orthodox Christian Reconquista, which has been foretold hundreds of years ago, more than 1,000 years ago, if we really look back at some of the very old ancient prophecies, whilst the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire was still around. And Russia's role in it, I think, has been foretold for a long time, and Russia is now rising to the occasion we can say this very clearly, just a generation since the year 2000 and since Putin has come to power. Russia has been reinvigorated by a real involvement and reinvestment into Christianity, and there's been an improvement every single year progressing forward. And I think, Conrad, as you've been to Moscow several times over the last few years, you can probably attest to that, just personally speaking to the people there, people in politics, members of the clergy. It's clearly the country is improving with every single year. And as it improves, clearly big opportunities open up. But, speaking about Turkey, Azerbaijan, all these nations, which, again, they put on a friendly face, right? For example, in Shanghai or in Beijing, and then, of course, they turn around and they stab you in the back. I'm pretty sure Vladimir Putin himself, he is very much, especially since he met with Trump in Anchorage in Alaska, and they looked so friendly and it was all very kind. And Kirill Dmitriev said all these nice things, if you recall, even when prior to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, Kirill Dmitriev, of course, Putin's personal aide in Washington, D.C., and now Trump lashes out, slaps both Dmitriev and Putin in the face with this weird comment about the 1991 borders. I mean, it's very extreme. And of course, this will be taken as a declaration of hostility by the Russian media, because Trump has never really lashed out at Russia as badly as he did now. And this is, the Russians have been respecting Trump in terms of even Maria Zakharova, who usually has a pretty big mouth, the blonde spokesperson for Sergei Lavrov in the Russian foreign ministry, which I'm not a big fan of personally, right? But I don't think a woman should be speaking for the Russian Federation. But in any case, like even she's been nice to Trump. So she usually says quite nasty things to foreign politicians and leaders. And it's just, I think, Conrad, Trump has been, someone has greenlit this particular occasion. Not that Trump can't make his own decisions, but clearly there's been a collective, and I don't know if this was King Charles or Trump's recent visit to the Windsor Palace. I don't know what exactly, but there's clearly a coordinated effort. And Trump meeting with the Arab leaders as well. The question will, of course, be which war wraps up first, the Israel-Iranian conflict and the whole Palestinian Gaza genocide, or the Russo-Ukrainian conflict? Because if one theater closes, the other one will go all out. And of course, the Eye of Sauron, which we keep mentioning, of the globalists of the unipolar world, will turn all of its attention towards Russia. And every single week, the drone attacks are increasing in severity, and these terror attacks are always escalating. And we know where it ends. Of course, it ends in a very large European war, which unfortunately, I don't think the liberal Europeans are actually prepared for. I don't think this is not going to be a war of World War II type scale. I don't think people are ready for mass conscription and drafting. And this is the harsh reality. This is when Russia goes to war with Turkey, as per the prophecies, Conrad, the Turkish people will be forcefully drafted and conscripted into war against the Russians, just as the Ukrainians have been. Then they're going to, the future government, the one that comes after Erdogan's, will not be sitting idly by allowing the Turks to conduct their own business. This is going to be a regional crisis, which we really haven't seen yet. The 12-day war between Israel and Iran will look like daisies in a field compared to what's coming. And I think people really need to prepare morally, first and foremost, before they sort of hear the news for the first time as they're sipping their coffee.
No, that's very true, and that's a prescient analysis and a good way to wrap up the Russia-Ukraine issue. Of course, we have fairly large updates from these other more peripheral fronts. Obviously, the Venezuela conflict is escalating rapidly. Another destroyer, the USS Stockdale, has entered the Caribbean Sea, so there's now 4 U.S. destroyers off the coast of Venezuela continuing to rattle the saber against Maduro. And the big development there, of course, was the U.S. mysteriously test-fired a 130,000-pound nuclear missile from the deep sea off the coast of Florida, near where they're deploying all sorts of new missile defense systems and missile launch systems to Puerto Rico, which is a continued escalation against Venezuela. But the rumor has it that apparently a lot of this is in response to Russia placing long-range bombers and even other missile launchers in Venezuela that could reach the United States soil. So this is, I guess, the United States responding, saying that we have total domination of the Western Hemisphere. And if the Russians are going to potentially put long-range missiles and long-range bombers in Venezuela, our enemy that we're trying to overthrow, then we are going to show that we will test nukes in this very relevant region, launching from our submarines. So big developments there. Maduro is obviously rallying his troops. He's claiming he's going to declare a sort of state of fear or a state of emergency. I don't really know what that means, but clearly I think he is feeling the pressure. Obviously, some of the regional actors, Brazil and Colombia, are not as aligned with the U.S. right now. However, the current Colombian president, I believe, lost, and Colombia is likely about to become a flashpoint where the U.S. is going to use their border region and the drug cartel and militia factions that battle it out on the Venezuelan-Colombia border. That will be used to escalate regime change wars against Maduro himself. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on the Caribbean and Venezuela there as, again, I mean, remembered last week, and we discussed in previous episodes how Marco Rubio and Trump have said that they aren't ruling out direct strikes on Venezuela and Maduro. And of course, they sunk another supposed drug-carrying vessel just off the coast of the Dominican Republic, which is having sort of, it's dividing public opinion worldwide on whether or not this is a noble endeavor or really just sort of for show to continue to escalate against one of their regional enemies. And of course, another conflict that is about to apparently escalate back that Trump claims to have totally solved is the Thailand Cambodia border war. Thailand is mobilizing more and more forces towards the border. Apparently, Cambodian troops fired on certain Thai troops. And the big news is that Thailand is basically claiming the territory that they annexed in the previous few days of war between the two countries as their own. They don't want to return to the internationally recognized borders. This is from The Star. It says the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation has rejected Thai accusations that Cambodian villagers in Bante Manche provinces encroached on Thai territory to stage protests, noting that the land remains formally undemarcated. Thai authorities have repeatedly called the area their own, using their territorial claims to justify the planned imposition of Thai domestic law on the villagers, who have lived peacefully in Prechon for decades. In a statement on Tuesday, September 23rd, the ministry offered a precise explanation for the current agreed demarcation. Cambodians have been living and farming in Prechon for decades, it said, predating the 2000 Memorandum of Understanding on the survey and demarcation of the border. The agreement requires both parties to maintain the status quo until the border demarcation is completed, and this is where the issue arises. So Thailand have mobilized not just in this region, but all across the region, and both sides have kind of escalated the bellicose rhetoric, so I wouldn't be surprised if we actually saw a reignition of this Indo-Chinese conflict between these two countries who, again, when it comes to mapping Thailand, Cambodia on the geopolitical World War III sort of faction map, it's a bit hard to determine because on the one hand, Thailand is considered a non-NATO ally of the United States, but they're also a very close infrastructure and economic collaborator with China. And China obviously is much more interested, I think, in securing the massive Thai economy and the independent Thai monarchy that was never colonized as a Chinese ally than they are the almost entirely landlocked, not entirely landlocked, but restricted and not as wealthy Cambodia. But we know they are, of course, a close Chinese ally as well. So we're going to, again, be keeping a close eye on this conflict, which of all the peripheral conflicts definitely is a bit more interesting to me than some of these others. But final, more peripheral conflict before we move on to church news or any other things that we've missed is news from Ladakh and Kashmir. The Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, which is Narendra Modi's ruling party office in Leh, which is in Ladakh, was set on fire Wednesday as protests in support of demand for statehood for Ladakh turned violent. A massive cloud of smoke could be seen rising from the BJP office as people shouted slogans in support of their demand for statehood. During the protests, people clashed with police personnel who resorted to firing of tear gas shells and deployed baton charge to disperse the crowd. The police action followed after a group of youth threw stones amid the huge protest and shutdown. The people of Ladakh have been demanding the elevation of Ladakh from its current union territory status to a full-fledged state, imparting it greater political autonomy and decision-making powers. Ladakh is advocating for inclusion in the constitutional provisions under the Sixth Schedule to protect cultural, linguistic, and land rights of the indigenous population. I'm wondering if any of this was inspired by the latest protests in Nepal, which, of course, Ladakh probably shares a lot of cultural and regional similarities to. Of course, we know that the supposed Gen Z revolution in Nepal that led to the new leader being elected via a Discord poll was obviously a U.S. Western operation meant to cleave Nepal, which was ruled by a communist party that, of course, would have been allied with communist China. They have now been cleaved away from that. So the U.S. peripheral wars against its land-based empire enemies, specifically China, Russia, and of course Iran, very much continues unabated. So obviously Ladakh, we've discussed it before. I am wondering if China actually, ironically, could have been behind this as well, pressuring India. I'm very skeptical of that because China and India have actually been moving closer together. They've been wanting to cooperate more, and both are, of course, refusing to stop buying Russian crude oil. Actually, Hungary and the foreign minister of Hungary recently said that we will not consider for even a second ceasing our purchases of Russian oil and Russian crude oil, even if the U.S. demands it. So Hungary is drawing a line in the sand that they are not going to continue down the anti-Russian path of Europe. But if you have any other peripheral conflicts, Dimitri, any other final pieces of news that we may have missed, or any thoughts on Venezuela, Ladakh, or Thailand, Cambodia, feel free to let me know before we move on to church news.
Yeah, of course. Only that, in September of 2025, a lot of the things we speak about in relation to Asian or Eurasian politics, of course, come in hindsight after the meeting in the first week of September that took place in China. This 80-year anniversary of the Chinese victory in the Second World War and those huge parades that took place. And essentially, we see somewhat of a breakdown of that between Thailand and Cambodia. Obviously, I think the Cambodian king was even present in China for those celebrations, and there was Thai politicians, and both sides were present. And yet now, obviously, there's big disagreements and movements of troops, and things may deteriorate very quickly in Southeast Asia. Whilst on the India-China angle, actually, just this week, it was the 75-year anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and India. And in fact, the Chinese ambassador to India, Zhu Feihong, actually said that the Chinese-Indian relations over the last 75 years have been overwhelmingly defined by friendly cooperation. So the Chinese attitudes towards the Indians at the moment are incredibly friendly. And I think primarily it's because, well, I'm just going to paraphrase Donald J. Trump into his speech at the General Assembly of the UN, right? Donald Trump clearly said that China and India are making the most money from the Ukraine-Russia war. I think that's not entirely true, right? For example, the Power of Siberia pipeline that was in the works long before this conflict even commenced, for example, the gas and oil sales and lumber sales to China have always been ongoing. India has always purchased Russian oil and other resources for decades, even during the USSR, prior to this SMO. Really, nothing has changed. If anything, things have just become a little bit more complicated. So these countries have not increased their purchases of Russian equipment. If anything, Russian military equipment sales, and I'm going off of official numbers from the last few years, and some of these numbers have become somewhat more secret, has only gone down. So for whatever reason, either the Russians are selling less equipment abroad and using a lot more domestically, obviously for anti-terrorism and SMO purposes, or perhaps the world is just not preferencing, so shall we say, Russian equipment as opposed to that of the West, or perhaps every nation is just at the moment experiencing the economic downturn of this, oncoming recession that we're all about to enter into and sort of go down the slide. And very interesting that the Kashmir protests, Conrad, this is like the pinnacle, the crux of the potential conflict between Pakistan and India in the Kashmir zone. And of course, mind you, Kashmir, a certain small portion of it, is still allotted to China, which has almost no people living there, literally just some shepherds in the hills and in the mountain ranges. But Kashmir is that breaking point between two nations, one of which, of course, is Pakistan. And Pakistan, at the recent UN Security Council meeting, which tried to vote in favor of the continuation of sanction relief for Iran, Pakistan voted in favor of that. So they wanted to continue to provide relief to Iran. Russia, China, and Algeria also voted in favor. But those 4 votes received no other support. They needed at least 9 votes in the UN Security Council in favor of Iran, and they only got 4. Pakistan was one of them. Notice India voted against. So it's just very curious that there's this sort of breakdown of Indian-Pakistani relations. Could, of course, always reignite, just as between Cambodia and Thailand over those disputed territories. The Kashmir is one of those breaking points. So we always have to keep an eye out on these particular events. But I think the recent Beijing meeting, where Modi, Xi Jinping, and their respective delegations met in person, and they both kind of said that, look, out of all the other civilizations in the world, we are representatives of some of the oldest ones that are still sort of running, functioning in the 2 most populous nations. And clearly there needs to be some sort of mutual respect, and simple territorial disputes, which really shouldn't define how these 2 countries get along. And really, I think the oddballs in BRICS at the moment, Conrad, the original BRICS nations, obviously is Brazil. How will Brazil react to a U.S. special military operation, to an Operation Desert Storm, 1990 style, in Venezuela? And Maduro even looks physiognomy-wise similar to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the former president of Iraq. How will Brazil, one of the BRICS countries, react to that? Brazil's supposed to be the hegemon of South America, the biggest, for what we can say, the most stable country in South America. There's not that many stable countries there, the most prosperous, so to speak, and yet it can't even answer for its own neighborly nations, so to speak, in its own vicinity. And of course, South Africa, well, they've been censured quite strongly for their anti-Israeli positions in the International Criminal Court recently, and there's all kinds of anti-South African views sort of going around in any case in the Trump administration. So it's very curious. We're always watching the peripheral nations, Conrad, because, as you said yourself, they're super relevant as to not just what's happening in the Middle East, but Europe and the entire world is, for better or for worse, hyper-globalized. What happens in one particular part will always affect the entire web of interrelated countries and nations and geographic locations, which we talk about here.
No, that's a very good point. And of course, we're moving a little faster than usual, so this won't be the longest episode, which I think is fine, but we have to move on to sometimes everyone's favorite section of the show, which is the church news segment. And of course, we have, I guess, a positive development here from Mount Sinai. This is from orthochristian.com. It says, new Mount Sinai abbot apologizes for scandal, promises unity and reform. The newly elected abbot of St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai has issued a public apology for any scandal caused by recent upheavals at the ancient Orthodox monastery, promising to restore normal operations and reunite the monastic community. Abbot Simeon, who was unanimously elected on September 14th to replace Archbishop Damianos after more than 5 decades of leadership, told Greek newspaper Vima Orthodoxius that his primary concern is the restoration of normal order in the monastery and in the brotherhood, the desired reunification, the normalcy which has already emerged from the unanimous election. I ask from the depths of my heart for public forgiveness if we scandalize the public opinion and the ecclesiastical community, whether intentionally or unintentionally, Father Simeon said in the interview published Sunday. The new abbot referenced St. John of the Ladder, whose spiritual work compares religious life to a ladder from earth to heaven, where Christ awaits. He noted that in this allegory, some climb undisturbed, while others are shot with arrows and fall, and the higher the step they are on, the greater the fall. This, he said, shows that the Orthodox Church knows the reality and struggle of people, and that those practicing holiness are not infallible. Abbot Simeon said his immediate priority is solving many small internal issues before traveling to Greece to prepare for his ordination as bishop by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, scheduled for a Sunday in October. Regarding concerns about tourism development around Mount Sinai, Father Simeon acknowledged that conditions have changed dramatically since he first arrived at the monastery in the 1980s. We are all concerned, but we hope in both states, he said, referring to Egypt and Greece. He emphasized the monastery's tradition of coexistence through dialogue while maintaining that when the faith is in danger, then it obeys God rather than men. The door is open to all, Simeon said, whether they are pilgrims to this God-trodden mountain or admirers of its historical treasures. The monastery's library contains the world's second largest collection of early codices and manuscripts, surpassed only by the Vatican Library. So it's good to see a positive development. I've heard from trusted sources that Archbishop Damianos was largely the problem in the previous situation. So I guess in a way we are siding with the brothers that protested him and left the monastery. Initially, it seems they are being restored to their status as brothers of the monastery, and we hope that Abbot Simeon, who I guess in the future will be Bishop Simeon, will do his best to lead this very interesting and unique ecclesiastical anomaly within the church in this very important monastery, obviously. I want to go there myself someday, see the burning bush, see the Pantocrator icon, see the incredible library. So now it seems that that is still going to be possible, assuming the Third World War doesn't sweep us off our feet and ruin things before then. But another article from Ortho Christian, and I, of course, spoke to Archbishop Markel about this myself. He reiterated this plea to me, so this is me reiterating it to you. It says, Moldovan Hierarch appeals to Vice President Vance for protection against state persecution. His Eminence Archbishop Markel of Balti and Felesti of the Moldovan Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, has directly appealed to the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance for intervention against escalating persecution by Moldovan authorities. During an interview with American and British journalists, Archbishop Markel made an urgent plea. Dear Vice President of the United States, this is actually from the interview that I had with Archbishop Markel. This is a direct quote that he said to myself, James Dellingpole, Charles Bousman, and a few others. He says, Dear Vice President of the United States, Mr. Vance, the whole world knows that you advocate for traditional values, the traditional family, and traditional Christian upbringing of the younger generation. In this sense, we are absolutely identical to you. We advocate for the same values, which is precisely why the Orthodox Church is constrained and persecuted. We are promised that PAS, our ruling regime, will win the elections on September 28th, and they will outlaw us. They will exclude an entire religious organization like the Orthodox Church of Moldova from legislation. And therefore, I wanted to appeal to you with a request. I ask you, dear Vice President, to intervene. Help us defend our traditional church. It is very easy for you, but it is very important for us. So obviously, this is an impassioned plea. I don't know if J.D. Vance listens to World War Now. I highly doubt it, but we're going to be posting all of this on Twitter and X, and we may even clip this. And of course, Archbishop Markel has been posting a lot of clips of my interviews recently discussing the persecution of the Moldovan church. So do everything you can to boost this message. Maybe can get to the desk or even the Twitter feed of J.D. Vance, and we could see some positive developments. Of course, we heard reports that J.D. Vance was repudiating Patriarch Bartholomew when Patriarch Bartholomew came to visit the White House about, his recognition of the schismatics. I've heard disputing reports about this. Some say this didn't happen. Some say it happened. Maybe it's something in the middle where it was brought up, but not really dramatically addressed. I really don't know. I was not in the Oval Office when this happened, obviously, but there are rumors that Patriarch Bartholomew has admitted that he has regrets and that mistakes were made when it came to the Ukraine situation. So hopefully, despite the fact that we said things appear to be escalating between the West and Russia in Ukraine, perhaps Patriarch Bartholomew's heart will begin to soften and we could see the revocation of the Tomos of Autocephaly. I'm not holding my breath for that, but we can all hope. Of course, this appeal, this is from the article again, comes days after reports that Vice President Vance confronted Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople about the persecution of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which he has been silent about. And again, I just explained that's somewhat disputed. The article goes on to say Archbishop Markel was detained at Chisinau Airport 3 times in recent months. During Holy Week, he was twice prevented from traveling to Jerusalem to retrieve the Holy Fire and later blocked from pilgrimage to Turkey. The hierarch compared current authorities to Stalin, warning of potential provocations. I can't rule out that you'll hear that either in my car or in my house they found either weapons or drugs or some other forbidden things, obviously claiming that they're going to plant things on him to persecute him unjustly. In June, authorities banned the Orthodox Church from holding a Pentecost procession while supporting LGBTQ Pride Week. President Maya Sandu has accused Russian Orthodox clergy of spreading propaganda and influencing elections, though no specific evidence has been provided. Yeah, in Moldova, they won't even let the church counter-protest pride parades or even do their own processions for important religious holidays. A Belgian member of the European Parliament, Barbara Bonti, submitted an inquiry to the European Commission questioning whether Moldova's treatment of religious minorities is compatible with European values. The inquiry cited a Lithuanian human rights report presented to the UN Human Rights Council documenting discriminatory policies conducted by Moldovan authorities against the Orthodox Church of the Republic of Moldova, canonically connected to the Russian Orthodox Church. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights indicated it will investigate the travel restrictions. As Moldova approaches parliamentary elections on September 28th, the ruling Party of Action and Solidarity has intensified rhetoric against the Orthodox Church, claiming clergy interfere in elections through pro-Russian narratives. And this is all, of course, a bunch of nonsense. It's clear that the EU has told Moldova that unless they get rid of the Russian church entirely, seize their churches, dissolve, their hierarchy, and subsume them into the Bessarabian Metropolia, which is under the Romanian Orthodox Church, that perhaps Moldova will not be allowed into the European Union at all. So this pressure is very unfortunate. I encourage everybody to follow Archbishop Markel on Twitter. If you just search Archbishop Markel, he will show up, and share the videos he's been posting of me short clips of me discussing the situation so people can understand this. Perhaps J.D. Vance or others in the White House and in the U.S. that with some influence, of course, over the Europeans could actually see this, because unfortunately, as we've said in the previous episode, which will be linked below, if you want to hear a full breakdown of the persecution in Moldova, my full report from my time on the ground there, check out the latest episode of Ether Hour. It's fully free for everybody. And of course, it's linked down below and you can find it at our homepage at worldwarnow.co. But this is potentially going to become a Ukraine 2.0, and we could see masked men, secret police storming churches, assaulting bishops and parishioners, just like we saw in Cherkasy and just like we saw in other places. And of course, speaking of Cherkasy, Metropolitan Theodosiy of Cherkasy wrote an open letter to Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, stressing that simply withdrawing the tomos is actually no longer sufficient under current circumstances, of course referencing Patriarch Bartholomew submitting the tomos of autocephaly and giving the schismatics in Ukraine their own church. Metropolitan, this is from the Union of Orthodox Journalists, by the way, Metropolitan Theodosiy of Cherkasy and Kanev of the Canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church has sent a detailed public letter to Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, urging him to revoke the tomos of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and to end persecution of the Canonical Church. The bishop described in detail the events of October last year when the largest Orthodox church in Ukraine, the Archangel Michael Cathedral in Cherkasy, was seized. During the takeover, priests, monks, and laypeople were crippled, they were gassed, their arms, legs, teeth, and heads were broken, shots were fired inside the cathedral, he wrote. Metropolitan Theodosiy himself sustained serious injuries. They tore my cassock, broke my staff, then struck me on the head with such force that I suffered a concussion. Only my monastic klobuk softened the blow and saved me from certain death. He recalled how he managed to appeal to Patriarch Bartholomew from the altar where the clergy were held as hostages. Particular indignation was caused by the recent visit of OCU head Epiphany Dumenko. The blood of monks and priests has not yet dried on the cathedral's floor. The wounds of the confessors of faith had not yet healed when Mr. Dumenko came to another's cathedral and unlawfully ascended my throne, the hierarch noted. Theodosiy stressed that Epiphany performed his rite, by that we mean Dumenko, performed his rite using stolen liturgical vessels, including the chalice that had been gifted to me personally by spiritual children on the day of my episcopal consecration. Meanwhile, on the gallery, OCU adherents piled icons of saints they refused to recognize for political reasons. We even heard that Ukrainian police used the altar as a toilet in this particular situation. The hierarch drew a direct parallel with the renovationist schism of the 1920s. Our church was in a similar situation after the Bolshevik coup when the new regime persecuted Christians and used a newly created pseudo-church of renovationists, he reminded. At that time, Patriarch Gregory VII of Constantinople sided with the renovationists, legitimizing them. He not only demanded that Saint Patriarch Tikhon abdicate his throne, but through his envoy even blessed a pseudo-council of the schismatics, Metropolitan Theodosiy emphasized. Today, a century later, the situation is repeating itself almost identically. The Ukrainian government is persecuting our church and striving for its total destruction. The Cherkasy bishop sharply criticized Ukrainian authorities for tolerating lawlessness. Corrupt police, prosecutors, and other agencies have not given and apparently will not give any assessment of the crimes committed by OCU representatives and their armed mercenaries. He noted that the Archangel Michael Cathedral de jure remains the property of the Cherkasy Eparchy of the UOC, while the occupiers use it by right of force. Meanwhile, the United Nations has already taken notice. In an official document, UN Special Rapporteurs highlighted the violent seizure of the Cherkasy Cathedral and the bloody beating of its defenders. The Metropolitan criticized Patriarch Bartholomew's statements about a possible future union between the OCU and UOC. Believe me, this will not happen, for there could be no union of Christ with Belial. Your unwavering stance is dangerous and destructive. It may well trigger a second great schism in the church, he warned. Metropolitan Theodosiy reminded the Patriarch of his declared wish to contribute to healing the first great schism of 1054, but observed, "In fact, Your Holiness, you may become the cause of the second great and irreversible schism in world orthodoxy." The letter contains a direct appeal to Patriarch Bartholomew to reconsider his decisions. Now you have not only many reasons, but also all the effective levers to correct this tragic mistake. Its fruits have already become evident to the whole ecumene. Theodosiy wrote. The hierarch emphasizes that merely withdrawing the tomos is not enough. What is needed is the annulment of the legalization of Ukrainian schismatics. They must repent of the skin of schism, and only then can the question of lawful ordinations be raised, he insisted. His Eminence also criticized the Patriarch's teaching of first without equals, calling it alien to the spirit of conciliarity. Otherwise, he warned, 2019 will become for the Church as tragic a milestone as 1054 once was. The letter concludes with an appeal. Today in your hands lie both the future peace of the ecumene and the potential irreversible schism of world orthodoxy. We beseech you, do not commit a fatal error, Your Holiness. The letter was translated into Greek. Earlier, the UOJ reported Patriarch Bartholomew's words that he will not revoke the tomos of the OCU. So, very, very strong and dramatic words from Metropolitan Theodosiy. And of course, my final word on this before I hand it over to Dimitri. This is another headline from Ortho Christian. Greek metropolitans condemn persecution of Ukrainian Orthodox Church as silence divides hierarchy. Hundreds of protest messages have flooded the Greek Orthodox publication Vimo Orthodoxias following its report on violent seizures of monasteries and churches in Ukraine by forces supporting the Zelensky government and the schismatic OCU. The attempted expulsion of His Beatitude Metropolitan Onufry of Kiev and all Ukraine, the head of the much persecuted but canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, has sparked outrage among Greek hierarchs, abbots, and leading political figures who openly condemn what they describe as brutality against the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Ukrainian authorities recently revoked the citizen of Metropolitan Onufry, a move interpreted as a prelude to his deportation. Analysts view this as the culmination of a strategy aimed at eliminating any alternative ecclesiastical center opposing the schismatic church created by Patriarch Bartholomew and the Ukrainian and American governments. In the past 6 months, dozens of historic monasteries have been seized, monks forcibly expelled, and holy relics transferred without community consent, the outlet writes. Images from the Kiev caves Lavra showed security forces compelling monks to abandon their cells, with accusations of a methodical plan to eliminate canonical orthodoxy in Ukraine. Despite private expressions of concern from many Greek bishops, the Holy Synod of the Church of Greece has not taken an official position. The Greek Foreign Ministry reportedly pressures for restraint to avoid disrupting geopolitical balances and Athens' support for Zelensky. The Greek Church as a whole recognizes the schismatic OCU, which is directly involved in the persecution of the canonical church, though several notable Greek bishops reject it. A senior hierarch told Vimeo Orthodoxia, "We all know that Onufry is being wronged. A hierarch who gave his life for Ukraine can't be deprived of citizenship. However, geostrategic balances do not allow us to speak openly. Behind closed doors, dissenting voices multiply." A metropolitan from Greek Macedonia spoke at a closed gathering about identifying orthodoxy with geopolitical imperatives. A hierarch from Crete warned that silence will be recorded as complicity in history. Another senior bishop noted that the people see the looting and wonder why we don't speak. Political figures from nearly all Greek parties express concern about developments. Opposition MPs speak of gross violations of human rights, while government officials state that Greece is closely monitoring the situation. The silence of the Church of Greece has created a gap with the faithful. Many lower clergy express indignation. A proto-syngelos of a provincial metropolis have emphasized, if we saw such images in another country, we would speak of persecution. Why do we pretend not to see it in Ukraine? Analysts note that while silence may be considered convenient today, it will be perceived as complicity in the future. History rarely forgives those who remain silent in the face of persecution, commented political analyst Petros Georgiadis. So, Dimitri, I don't know if you have any other updates on the persecution situation both in Moldova and in Ukraine, but I would love to hear your thoughts on these major developments.
No, I'm just going to have to mirror the concerns of the Greek Orthodox clergy with another quote, actually from a church across the Black Sea, Archpriest David Dishkariani, actually. So Father David, a very well-known Georgian Orthodox Christian archpriest, very well respected in Georgia. I mean, Georgia has a lot of local elders who really, they don't have any sort of internet popularity whatsoever, but local people know them and respect them. And Archpriest David was asked the question about the Kiev Pechersk Lavra relics, the fact that they're being taken by the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture, and now there's literally DNA tests and all kinds of samples are being extracted from the relics and being tested in laboratories, and Lord knows what else is being conducted on them. And he replied with the following, and I'm just going to read this English translation. "In the churches, the saints who rest there are inviolable. Whoever touches them with their hand will be punished, and indeed, they are being punished." So this is Archpriest David's words, well-respected elder of the Georgian Orthodox Church. And it's true. If the Ukrainian government continues to push the envelope in terms of sacrilege, in terms of blasphemous acts, then, of course, many of those who side with them will most likely perish in the conflict which currently rages and will probably escalate further as punishment from God. I mean, this is just absolutely disgusting what's currently taking place. And correctly put, Conrad, the Metropolitan Theodosius was correct in sort of trying to reach Patriarch Bartholomew, but the most recent surprise was from New York when Patriarch Bartholomew, of course, met President Zelensky on the 22nd of September. So just 2 days ago, they shook hands, and as they were shaking hands, the greeting was, Patriarch Bartholomew says, "Slava Ukraini," and Zelensky replies, "Geroyam Slava." And I mean, what else is, like, really? And of course, Zelensky can't take a blessing from the Patriarch because he's Jewish. So, I mean, like, yeah, it's just very sad. And of course, then I just have to quote Patriarch Bartholomew here, because he says, "You are a fighter. You have to continue to fight and continue to encourage everyone." And then he says that at the end, you collectively will obtain victory because you have the truth behind you and the truth is on your side. This is Patriarch Bartholomew's comments to Zelensky. So 2 days ago, very unfortunate that the ecumenical patriarch, and we can't even say that this is a public statement from somebody else because he says it himself on camera. It's his lips that pronounce this nonsense, essentially. And we just have to conclude that the most charitable interpretation here will be that this is some sort of geriatric, senile ramble, because clearly Zelensky is not even an Orthodox Christian. I don't know what kind of victory we can speak about here. I mean, the most pro-Ukrainian thing he could have said from an Orthodox position would be that we are praying for both sides. This is a civil war. This is, both sides are committing sins. But he doesn't even take it that far. He says Ukraine needs to continue fighting. The truth is on your side, which it clearly isn't if the Ukrainian, the persecution of the church is only escalating. And so, yeah, that's the unfortunate position that we're in at the moment. And, speaking of persecution, another update, the Ukrainian criminal court has now issued a warrant of arrest of Father Vadim Novinsky now. And he potentially, the Ukrainian prosecution is looking to put him away for 15 years. Now, why? Because he's been speaking about pro-Russian narratives in the media and spreading anti-government sentiments and justifying Russian aggression against Ukraine. Now, if this was just a regular deacon or priest, I would be concerned. But Father Vadim Novinsky has a certain asset, or shall we say assets, plural, in his name. He is, in fact, the richest Orthodox Christian clergyman in the entire world. He's actually an Orthodox Christian deacon of 5 years. He was made a deacon in 2020, just during the COVID pandemic, by the Canonical Church of Ukraine, so Metropolitan Onufry. And it's very interesting. He's a very interesting deacon because he's a contemporary billionaire. So he has several, I think, some billions in his name. He currently lives in Switzerland. In fact, he moved to Switzerland in 2023 because of fear that the Ukrainians would actually begin targeting him as the richest Orthodox Christian deacon. It's rare, Conrad, that we have a millionaire, let alone a billionaire, become a clergyman in the Orthodox Church. But Father Vadim Novinsky is one of them. He's actually of mixed heritage of of Armenian and Russian background. So quite an interesting fellow. And he wanted to dedicate his life to the church. And can you imagine just the quantifiable wealth he's given into charity and all kinds of things, the programs he's promoted. But yeah, the Ukrainian government is simply looking for him now. So he is currently hiding somewhere in Switzerland. And of course, he has the money to protect himself, but we should still keep him in our prayers as he is, I guess, on paper, the richest Orthodox Christian clergyman to date. So Father Vadim is now the next target. They're trying to just take out all the notable clergymen who speak out in favor of, orthodoxy in Ukraine. And, speaking of speaking out in favor of orthodoxy, the one figure who we've actually, somewhat criticized him in prior years because of his, shall we say, silence on the issue. But Sergei Lavrov, in a recent interview, has positively mentioned the persecution against the church in terms of, he said that, look, it was a big subject. And he said, Russia needs to continue to fight for religious freedoms in Ukraine and to stop the persecution of the church taking place there. And very importantly, Sergei Lavrov actually said that when Putin and his delegation and Lavrov himself met up with Donald J. Trump in Anchorage, Alaska, it was mentioned to Trump that the church was being persecuted in Ukraine. And Lavrov said that Trump was surprised. He never heard about the persecution in Ukraine until this year. And apparently he even asked Marco Rubio in front of the Russian delegation and asked him, whispered into his ear basically and said, well, is this true? Is the church really being persecuted in Ukraine? And Marco Rubio basically had to nod his head or something like that. It's so interesting that this is why the bishops in Ukraine and the bishops in Moldova, they appeal to J.D. Vance specifically because probably through Tucker Carlson, some of J.D.'s connections, they've actually been aware of this issue, whereas the Trump administration, maybe people around him, haven't been keeping Trump in the know. In fact, Trump may not even be aware of Pompeo's prior promotion of the whole Tomos project to begin with. So it's very, if we had to trust Sergei Lavrov's recent interview, less than a week ago now, it's just very curious as to how the entire situation is developing. But generally, Conrad, I would say that in terms of Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, Russian Orthodox Christians, and again, American Orthodox Christians, of course, everyone has reacted very positively towards how, in such a Christian-like manner, Charlie Kirk has, responded like, in terms of promoting family values and to the fact that her husband was assassinated and murdered. I've seen dozens of articles by Russians. In fact, the most prominent one was there was an article published this week by Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov of Simferopol and all of Crimea, right? Obviously, the second most prominent bishop in, I would say, well, obviously in Europe, but clearly in Russia after Patriarch Kirill himself. He published a very positive article about both Erica and Charlie Kirk and his role in promoting Christian values in the West. And it's just very interesting how, Charlie Kirk, a political commentator who always sort of kept his eye on Christ, even from a Protestant perspective, has left such a mark even on, say, the old world, and how positively everyone viewed him. Even, I think, in light of the promotion of these degenerate values, Charlie Kirk was somewhat of a refreshing type figure, especially for Russians, how they viewed, say, so-called American cultural neo-Marxist values being promoted. He was somewhat of that old American Christian, those old, Protestants who tried to spread the faith into Soviet Union, communist Russia, because I think Metropolitan Tikhon, from his community in the Pskov monastery, he was actually, there was a lot of Russians in the USSR. Actually, the first Bible that they've ever read were actually Protestant Bibles that Protestants smuggled. And these are like evangelical American, like hardcore people who tried to evangelize the atheistic USSR. They smuggled these Bibles into the Soviet Union. So there is this interesting link between the hardcore Orthodox Christian community in Russia and, I would say, almost like the WASP Protestant traditional Americans, which it goes back to the Cold War, but there is a link there, which is very curious. And, it's very interesting how the entire Russian Orthodox Church essentially is getting behind Charlie Kirk and his wife, and essentially saying that, yeah, all the values that they're promoting, all the things that they're speaking about, and Erica Kirk, of course, forgiving the murderer of her husband, the alleged killer, that young degenerate, in front of everyone. I mean, that harkens back and essentially reflects literally the act of Saint Elizabeth Fyodorovna, right? The sister-in-law of Tsar Nicholas II. I mean, we recall how she forgave the terrorist who killed her husband, the governor of Moscow. And I mean, that's the first thing I thought of when I heard that particular announcement on stage. And it's just very powerful, to say the least.
No, I've obviously sort of been out of the loop, or rather my commentary has not made it to the airwaves about the Charlie Kirk situation. And in many ways, I'm grateful for that. I think it was just sort of a traumatic event in general, and that includes trying to parse through whether or not it was a false flag, whether or not there was some deep conspiracy involved. And at a certain level, obviously I'm interested, I'm keeping tabs on it, but I don't, and when I say I don't care, I don't mean I don't care about Charlie and his family and the impact this is having. But at a certain level, I think whoever did this, whether it was the forces of darkness and the devil that orchestrated it as has been described by the media, or if it's some more nefarious plot, getting incensed and arguing about it, and of course, trying to come up with theories, I don't think is necessarily super useful. The most productive thing that's come out of this is we've had tens of thousands of leftists fired from their job, and for that, I think we have succeeded. Obviously, the memorial, I think, had a certain level of distastefulness to it. It was effectively a Republican voter registration rally. There were fireworks, there was people coming on stage with clapping and everything, which, again, not that we don't rejoice in the life that somebody led, but it was supposed to, I think, could have easily been a bit more of a somber occasion. So, that's sort of my perspective on that. Obviously, I'm praying for Charlie Kirk, praying for his family. I had a lot of friends that worked directly with him that have known Charlie since before Charlie was even 18. So, as much as I'm open to certain conspiratorial ideas, I'm remiss to say that Charlie Kirk was somehow an actor or something like this. However, obviously there are some interesting suspicious rabbit holes that people could go down. But in general, we need to be praying for peace for America. And of course, left-wing terrorism is clearly a problem. As we were recording this, 3 ICE agents were shot dead by some kind of Antifa leftist, and that leftist then killed themselves. So the problem of left-wing political violence in America is continuing to escalate. Trump designated Antifa as a terrorist organization today. We've seen recent mass arrests at Antifa protests, so I think that is nothing but a good thing. Obviously, there were certain initial calls for censorship and hate speech laws from Pam Bondi that thankfully the right and those on the side of Charlie Kirk repudiated immediately. So I think in general, again, whether you think the right-left paradigm is a psyop, whether you have much love for the American conservative movement, I know I have my critiques. I don't consider myself a part of that movement, and is it, of course, deeply Zionist and not monarchist as the perspective that I hold. But ultimately, it shows that even with their issues, the conservative movement is far more righteous and virtuous than anybody claiming to be on the left in the United States. But final news here, breaking news effectively as we are discussing this. I just broke the story about the death toll at the ICE facility in Dallas. Be sure to follow the socials. I don't have all the details on that. I'm sure more will be coming out. But Zelensky recently took the stage at the UN General Assembly, and he talks about how drone warfare has changed everything, how he compares the struggle of Ukraine to the struggle of Sudan and Palestine and other places. So he's trying to build international sympathy. But I actually found the most interesting part of his remarks were that he said, Russia is trying to attack Moldova, and Europe cannot afford to lose this country, and Moldova should not be lost. The European Union must help Moldova immediately, not only through funding, but also by providing full support. Russia is trying to do to Moldova what Iran once did to Lebanon. The global response is not enough. And that comment is fascinating because I'm assuming he's effectively referring to Iran's influence over the Shia population of Lebanon, comparing the Orthodox population in Moldova, 95% of whom are under the Orthodox Church in Moldova, which is part of the Moscow Patriarchate, effectively equating them with Hezbollah or Shia militant figures that, of course, are currently being forced to disarm and, having the saber rattled against them by the United States for the Lebanese armed forces to disarm them. He seems to be advocating for Maya Sandu and her PAS party to, effectively disarm the Orthodox Church in Moldova and these supposed Russian sympathizers. And instead of disarming them from weapons, which they of course don't have, they'll simply be disarming them in the spiritual war, seizing their temples, potentially arresting their priests and bishops. And of course, as we reported in our episode recently about Moldova, threatening to beat people up and even in some cases actually assaulting people and threatening to kill them. So this is a very unfortunate development. Zelensky went on to say, we have already lost Georgia and Europe to Russia. So I guess that's a positive sign. If even Zelensky is admitting that supposedly Georgia is lost to the Russian sphere of influence, I think that is going to only bode well for the small nation of Georgia, which is itself devoutly Orthodox Christian. So Zelensky is, of course, rallying the troops, not just against Russia, but apparently doing the bidding of his EU masters who, of course, want him to eventually enter the European Union in the tiny Orthodox country of Moldova that we encourage everyone to read up on, listen to our episodes, and share. Share all of that stuff. Share it with your priests. Share it with your bishops. Share it with every Christian that you know, because the only way that we're going to stop this is if American Christians rise up against it and say something, and if potentially Trump and J.D. Vance catch wind of this and can actually stand up against, of course, the LGBT neoliberal globalism of Maya Sandu and, unfortunately, her Romanian backers, which, again, I know there are Romanian bishops and Romanian priests that are against this, but unfortunately, the Romanian church is very much under the thumb of their totally occupied European Union government. So with all of that, I think we have reported on most of the news this week. Dimitri, I will leave you with some final words.
No, of course. And it may come as a surprise that, a lot of the episode we were covering was taking place at the United Nations. But I think this particular year, the escalation that has taken place and just all the pressure points in the Middle East, Europe, South America, and even in Asia itself, I think it's very obvious that the world is standing on the brink of a very hot conflict. Everyone is trying to either invest in it in one way or another or to stop it from taking place. But I think it is a little bit too far gone in terms of just how certain sides have played it out, especially in Ukraine. You can see this in Donald Trump's unfortunate recent messaging, in the way that Europe is now standing, escalating the matter, pushing it forward. Russia is arming Belarus. Clearly, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict is going to be an ongoing subject. And yes, February is fast approaching. As I said off-air to Conrad, it's literally going to be the 4th year anniversary of the war. And the Russo-Ukrainian SMO conflict, the war as we like to call it, will be longer than the Great Patriotic War, the World War II, with Russia's participation. So it'll clearly leave its mark on the landscape and the Russian people for years to come. It's already longer than the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, longer than the Russo-Japanese War, longer than the Crimean War. And who knows exactly how the Middle East will play out. There are so many parties and different views of essentially what should happen in Palestine, but we need to pray for the innocents involved on all sides, and of course, especially the Orthodox Christians and the Christians who are facing, I think, at this point, inevitable persecution in some of these conflict zones, such as Moldova, Ukraine, and the Holy Land. Thank you.
We did our best to cover everything this week. Obviously, I'm coming to you from Moscow, so keep me in your prayers. I should potentially be doing an interview with Ortho Christian this week, and after that, I can't say too much, but I will be going somewhere very, very fascinating. And if you follow me on the socials, you will hear about that very, very soon. I can only promise that some of the most incredible World War Now content is on the way this very week. So please, please, please support us. Get behind that paywall at worldwarnow.co if you want to support the work that we are doing. We cannot do this without our paid subscribers. So please, if you enjoy this content, if you listen to the free World War Now episodes every week, please, please get behind that paywall and help keep this show going, help keep the lights on here at the proverbial World War Now bunker. Obviously, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com is our home base where you can get all of that. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube as well. You can just search World War Now. You can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, pretty much most places where podcasts are found. Obviously, follow us on X at World War Now _. I'm on X at Gnomerad, like a garden gnome, GNOMERAD. Dimitri's on X at WWN host. We're on Telegram as well at World War Now Telly. And I'm sure in the future I might be making a Ko-Fi or a Buy Me a Coffee for those of you that wish to continue to support me monetarily outside of just the monthly subscription. So please stay tuned for that. And with all of that, keep me in your prayers as I am traveling abroad. It is very, very important. Keep Dimitri in your prayers as well. And of course, we are praying for all of you. And we hope that, again, the world can achieve peace and that orthodoxy could grow. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.